Would anybody like to, you guys? Or is it too early? Or should I mention someone? What about, let's see. What about, Mariana, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, yesterday we talked a little bit about the period of Cardenas and
Mhm.
how like the expropiación petrolera helped further in Mexico with economy and all that stuff, and basically talking a little bit about independence and stuff like that.
Okay, yeah, we went a little bit over Lázaro Cárdenas' period as a president, right? We also went over Miguel Alemán Valdez as a president as well. We talked about nationalization of oil industry and also how he nationalized other things, right? How he was able finally to to enforce that Article 27 that was pending there, right, for over 20 years. Thank you. Okay, so the team, who's the team? Are you guys ready?
Yes,
Okay.
teacher,
Yes,
we're
we're
ready.
Okay, so this period of time, you guys, the period of times that we are going to start talking about is a period of time of economic development. Okay, uh, one thing that that was not entirely mentioned before is that from Lázaro Cárdenas and so on and on after Lázaro Cárdenas, Mexico started implementing these policies that were called políticas easy. And these policies were policies that aimed at protecting Mexican industry. So basically, it was the implementation of protectionism as an economic strategy to make a Mexican industry grow. Basically, these type of policies include the implementation of economic barriers, okay, taxation, quotes, all these kind of things to reduce the entrance of foreign products into our country and to promote the consumption of national products and also both basic products like for people and also intra-industry trade, right? And so this is an interesting stage of Mexican history because it basically is completely the opposite of what happened in Mexico during the 90s and the early 2000s. And so let's begin. You guys, please go ahead.
Okay. Um, so we are team number 2, and our topic today is economic development, stability, and active foreign policy. The period of time is 1946 to 1970s. The next one, please. What we are going to see in the next presentation is, firstly, we're going to focus mostly on the Cold War and all of the implications that it had, as well as multilateralism and the system of the United Nations. The years between 1946 and 1970s were of great importance for the international relations. This because during those times, what was the Cold War affected a lot to the international system, as the world was basically divided and everything. Um, During this time, the European continent had lost the leadership that it had had during the 16th century, and the title of leadership had passed on to the United States and the Soviet Union. They were so powerful that they had to get a new term that was called superpower. Um, it was during those years that the world feared destruction, as those superpowers now had nuclear weapons in their hands, and many countries thought that this would eventually like end the world because they knew that the power of the nuclear weapons was so powerful that not even they could destroy their enemies, but they will destroy themselves as well. So in this chapter, we are going to talk about the what the Cold War, how the Cold War affected the different nations and the international system. We are also going to talk about multilateralism and the reasons why Mexico first had a closed foreign policy and then a very active one. Next one, please.
Okay, so at the end of the Second World War, that was the most devastating conflict that humanity ever known, a new panorama was formed, which was essential to give a new orientation for Mexican foreign policy. The traditional and historical principles for their external conduct were kept in force, like the free self-determination, non-intervention in the domestic affairs of nation, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Although the most devastating conflict ended, an acute tension arose between the two superpowers, that was the United States and the Soviet Union, which was called the Cold War, that they defeated the Nazis and its allies, and was called Cold War because for more than 40 years the superpowers had a permanent amnesty, so they never came to face war because that would lead the Third World War. The next one, please.
So, due to the fact that the world was divided during the Cold War, a confirmation of blocks were created. And let's remember that at first semester, Dr. Gaby explained to us how the world division functioned during the Cold War. We have the first world, which was the United States with its allies, which were in the capitalist bloc. The second world, which were the Soviet Union allies within the socialist bloc, and the third world, which was the non-aligned countries. And let's remember that Dr. Gaby mentioned that it was some kind of coincidence that the third world were also the developing countries, because nowadays some people use the term third world to mention or to talk about the developing countries, and it goes all back to the Cold War. Next one, please. So as you can see, in the red would be the second world, the green would be the first world, and the yellowish would be the third world or the non-aligned countries. Next one. But the Mexico had an economic development since it was higher during the times of the war, because the necessity or the need of raw materials from the US took over 90% of the US market. So Mexico were exporting the items that we had, and that was the time for major internal peace within Mexico. But it didn't last forever because, can you go to the next slide, please? Because when the Cold War started, is the United States focused more on combating or fighting the Soviet Union, that it stopped asking for products to Mexico. So Mexico started what it is called a closed market or import substitution market as their foreign policy. This means that Mexico, sorry, had to go through a new foreign policy, creating what was called the closed market or import substitution market. But how does this work? Can you no can you go to the next one, please? Oh no, go back. Okay. So the closed market is basically that
or import substitution market means that if Mexico is importing a product from a foreign country and Mexico is producing that product here in the national territory, it will stop gradually importing that product from another country to implement or to make higher or to help the national enterprises to grow, helping the national economy. So that way it could create new jobs, create security, and aid the national land to be richer, if you can say it like that. Next one, please.
So now talking about Mexican's foreign policy, we have to set up the international context, which was the Cold War, as we mentioned before, and this meant that international tensions kept building up. So for states such as Mexico, it proved more difficult, and it was almost like backing them up into a corner because they had to remain neutral in those kinds of situations, but also have a foreign policy that allowed them to develop, and that's what Mexico did in here. And due to geographical reasons, which is that the US and Mexico are neighboring states, and the historical reasons, which can be explained that the economic relations that they established after the World War I, that it made Mexico's foreign trade depend almost on an American market. And before this point, Mexico's foreign policy had always had pretty much an abstentionist foreign policy, that they didn't want to get involved in conflicts. And this was the case in the Cold War, because it wasn't in their national interest to go to war. It wasn't their any objective. There wasn't any purpose into going into it. So by having a relationship with the United States, they were kind of backed up in the corner. So they had to create a foreign policy that allowed them to remain neutral and also better the relationship with the US and to not antagonize the Soviet Union against them. Can you go to the next slide? So this was how the goodwill policy started. And in that context, the President Miguel Alemán corresponded to President Harry Truman to be the first American president to come to Mexico. And Miguel Alemán was also the first president to go to the United States, as both formally representing their countries. The purpose was to inaugurate the new goodwill policy, and even though they established those cordial bilateral relations, they still were unwilling to participate in any conflicts. And there was also this example that during the Cold War, we know the Korean War, it was started by the two main powers, and there was a conference by the United Nations to send aid to South Koreans, but Mexico decided not to attend. That was to the extent that they didn't want to get involved into anything related to the Cold War. It was a struggle for world hegemony that was completely foreign to Mexico and their national interest, as I mentioned before. Sorry if you can hear my dog barking. And so the Mexican government found a possibility and an opportunity to achieve better economic and social development. After that was the objective after the revolution, and yeah, to have a more external and dynamic presence in the international scheme. And I think it was Miguel Alemán's presidency that was kind of the build-up to what we know that we know that period of the Mexican economy that was named the Desarrollo Estabilizador, I'm sorry. And yeah, that's what my partner is going to talk about next.
Now, we get to what Mexico actually wanted. As Juno explained, the United States were looking for world hegemony, and Mexico could not help that because it was a big risk for them. The United States were looking for world domination, and Mexico couldn't even dominate itself properly. So, what Mexico really needed was obtaining credits for finance. In this case, anything that would boost economic development. Some examples are oil, electric, chemical, and steel industries, and infrastructure. All of the projects designed during this time were actually planning to aid industrialization and to allow the private sector to become more participative. Next one, please. This brings us to three main relevant topics that come into play with this relation between Mexico and the United States. In this case, we talk about trade, the hiring of farm workers by the U.S. companies with the Bracero program, and the fight against aftosa fever, also known as hoof and mouth fever, that plagued cattle in both countries. Next one, please. Now, this brings us to the description of the actual relations that were going on during this time. It is said that the closest and tightest relations between countries should promote what are known as positive ties. These refer to trade, migration, tourism, and exchanges of any type. But they are actually counterproducing because they make relations become complicated and difficult, and they actually cause more issues to arise. This happens especially when there is an intense relation, which is what we know as a relation with a great asymmetry of power, whether it be military, economic, or political. It represents an imbalance of power. In this case, an example is Mexico and the United States. The problem here is that always the weight of the biggest power will be felt. So there will always be that sort of unfairness for either one of the actors. Next one, please. With this, we arrive to the actual issues, which tell us that even if there was a peaceful coexistence at this time, and even if the governments tried to keep everything harmonious, there were still problems related to the previous mentioned topics: trade, oil, farm workers, fight against diseases, and especially in the multilateral scope. Now, to explain the multilateral scope, we must know what multilateralism is, which is the next part. Next, please.
Yeah, it's me. Hello. So multilateralism is basically when the countries get together for a specific goal. For example, the first one to begin was the League of Nations, created in 1999 after the Treaty of Versailles was firm in the after the First World War. And then, due to this failure of the first organization, caused the outbreak of the Second War, and a second organization was created, which was the United Nations. It was found in 1954, and it was an important international actor for the system, formed by 51 nations. And his main objective was the maintenance of peace and security in the theme of economic, politics, and society, everything. And it was confirmed by a series specialized organization as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, and the Food Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And as an example, well, in Mexico and the United Nations, Mexico was aspired that political and economic, the political military corporation becomes an economic corporation to promote development in the region. And Mexico's foreign policy had two important fields on action: bilateral, bilateral diplomacy with the nations that maintain the political relations, and multilateral diplomacy in the international relations. And as an example, the Great Age multilateralism. Um, yeah, it took place not only in the global level through the United Nations system, but also in the regional level. And the Inter-American Conference of the Problem of War and Peace that took place in the Castle of Chapultepec in 1945. This was one of the antecedents of the post-war multilateralism, and the objective was to define terms of cooperation between the United States and the Latin American nations. However, the position of the US was to continue its ideological and political battle against the Soviet Union. And due to this, Washington took advantage and approved the Internal American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, which is the TERIR, which established a military alliance of the Soviet Union and against US. And lastly, due to these events, Mexico raised serious objections regarding to the objectives pursued by the region institution, which basically only responded to the international interests of the United States, and there was a cooling between those superpowers. And I think that will be the class activity.
We have also the video.
Oh yeah, hold on. Mm. It's a little slow. A little slow. It was
En el minuto 3:50.
sí. Hold on. This is taking so long.
Perhaps someone else can help you.
Yes, I'm gonna pass the link through the group, but can you like project the activity in the meantime?
Hold on.
industria de la guerra. Estados Unidos muy pronto se convirtió en el principal socio económico de México. Para 1945, este país acaparaba el 84% de las importaciones y exportaciones mexicanas. Esto quiere decir la mayor parte de los productos que México vendía al extranjero tenían como destino final los Estados Unidos, mientras que también la mayor parte de los productos que México compraba de otros países provenían principalmente de Estados Unidos. Ingreso a organismos internacionales. En 1945, alrededor del final de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, México fue uno de los 51 estados o países que constituyeron la Organización de las Naciones Unidas. 3 años más tarde, en 1948, México participó en la Conferencia de Bogotá, antecedente directo de la Organización de Estados Americanos. La fundación de la OEA, Organización de Estados Americanos, fue parte de la estrategia de Estados Unidos durante el conflicto conocido como la Guerra Fría, que se llevó a cabo desde esa época y hasta 1991 entre los mismos Estados Unidos y la Unión Soviética. En 1952, Fulgencio Batista, apoyado por el gobierno de Estados Unidos, a través de un golpe militar, tomó el control de la isla de Cuba. De esta manera, Estados Unidos podía intervenir en los asuntos de la isla a su propia conveniencia. Fidel Castro inició un comando revolucionario de resistencia al año siguiente, en 1953, y con ello da inicio a la Revolución Cubana, que finalmente resulta triunfadora en 1959. El gobierno del entonces presidente de México, Lázaro Cárdenas, vio con ojos de simpatía a la Revolución Cubana, así como otros grupos en México, como el Partido Social Comunista. Sin embargo, Estados Unidos entró en conflicto con el gobierno de la isla y ha permanecido en esa situación desde entonces. En 1961, el gobierno de Cuba se declara socialista y las dificultades
Ya de ahí es un poco irrelevante.
continúan y se acrecentan. En 1900
So I guess that's gonna be it. We already finished with the presentation. We can give you the activity. We already passed it through the to the group chat. In case you want to do it.
I guess that, like, thank you guys. I guess that you guys can do it and post it on the wall as you did with the activities last semester. So we can see. Yeah.
I put it in the
Um,
chat in here. I don't know if you can see it.
yes, we can. I can.
Okay.
Yes, it's right there. So if you guys want to lead the group with the answering of the activity, go ahead. We have 20 minutes left. So
Miss, we're just waiting to someone help us to put the video in the screen.
the video for the activity or what?
No, the video for the class is a little video that explains, like,
Ah,
summarizing, yeah, the class. But this is the activity just meanwhile.
They already played the video.
yeah. I don't know what you guys were talking about. I was a little confused. The video was already played. Yes. Okay. I guess that this you guys can work it. You guys can work this on your own and then upload it on the wall. Thank you guys. I'm gonna take the last 15 minutes just to summarize things, to and also to explain to you a couple of things. Okay. So the first, what we're going to summarize, or how we can explain this part of Mexican foreign policy, would basically mean a lot of action and a lot of activity from our country in the international system. This is the first time that Mexico becomes so participative in the, let's say, in the international system. And there was always this sense in Mexican foreign policy when the Cold War started, that Mexico had to find this balance between being this good neighbor with the US, but also being neutral in the Cold War, because Mexico did not have the capacities, right, that the US or that the Soviet Union had. And so Mexico became really active in the non-alignment movement. And this, Mexico knew that this wouldn't be this wouldn't please the US so much. However, the interdependence in trade, okay, allowed Mexico to take a little bit of more distance when it was about foreign policy, both in the multilateral and in the bilateral relations. Now, in the multilateral relations, as the team explained, okay, regarding the multilateral relations, the thing is that you know that the US, for example, with the Korean War, the US tried to push all of the international organizations into backing its plans for invading other territories or imposing liberal economics on other states, right? And Mexico was smart enough most of the times to remain neutral in these cases and not support nor go against the U.S. position towards certain things. I know we will see that in the next classes. For example, Mexico always kept a good relationship with Cuba, despite the attempts of the U.S., right, to overthrow Fidel Castro. Mexico actually, Fidel and Che Guevara lived in Mexico for a while before going into the Cuban Revolution. And so Mexico managed this balance, US and the rest of the Latin American world as well. Although or many of our presidents and policies were more on the left side than on the right side. All of Politicas Easy, the ones that were explained by your classmate, all of those policies were more on the left side than on the right side. However, we never suffered a direct intervention of the US, or at least not in the way that it was done, for example, of course, Cuba, but also Chile and some Central American countries, where the U.S. Clearly went in to prevent any socialist government to rule in those countries. And so it was active, and it was this eternal struggle for balance, right? I think that Mexico did a good job in trying to keep this balance between, okay, so we have a lot of economic interdependence with the US, but we are also distant and independent, not interdependent, but independent in our own foreign policy uh, implementation, right? So those are the things that we can say about this period of time of Mexican foreign policy, right? I don't know if there are any questions or comments, you guys. No questions or comments? Okay, the other thing that I wanted to tell you is that next week is your exam. I don't remember if I told you this yesterday, to be honest. But next week will be your exam. Yes, Susana, you have a question.
No, it was more of a comment. Can I?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, yes.
Um, that I'm kind of glad that in this part of history, Mexico did not let the U.S. do as he wanted, as when it was the 30s, 40s, when the United States took a lot of advantage from Mexico and took a lot of territory and did whatever it wanted with us in our foreign policy. And yes, so I'm kind of glad that Mexico started to put limits on the interventions that other states did with it on their internal affairs. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susana. Yes, I agree with you. I think I am also really glad. But the interesting thing to observe here is that it was done, or the reasons why Mexico was allowed to do this in a lot of ways were internal reasons. As we were discussing yesterday, the fact that Mexico achieved internal control, internal cohesion, unity, economic stability, a lot of public support for the president. These allowed Mexico to become a stronger actor in the international realm. And I think it's always interesting because sometimes we think of foreign policy as this thing that only happens in the international system, when the internal factors are always determinant if we want to achieve a more a more a stronger position in the international system. Of course, external factors will be of importance as well. But what I want to say, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that both internal and external are important. And I think that in the case of Mexico, of course, the external factors favored its position, but it was able to become, let's say, a leader in the non-aligned movement because of how strong it was internally. And these policies, the easy policies, in Spanish is in industrialización por sustitución de importaciones, right? Allowed the economy in Mexico to become stronger. And so, yeah, I'm also glad. Now, these, as we will see in the next classes, this Mexican miracle ends by late 70s. And when the crisis comes to these policies, Mexico seems in the need to have other economic system. And so the change in economic system also changes Mexican foreign policy. But we will talk about that later. Okay, so questions, you guys? Anyone has a question? So here's the thing. I know I gave you the dates to present. And next class for for the next term, here's what we're going to do. Please everybody pay attention to this because I really don't want to repeat this 1,000 times. What we're going to do next class, which is next Tuesday, okay, is that we're going to have the exam okay, in the first hour of the class, which is 8:40, right? We're gonna have the exam from 8:40 to 9:30. Okay, that's the first hour of the class. And then from 9:30 to 10:20, we are going to have the presentation by the team. Okay. Of course, that the exam will be not, it won't be that long for you. I mean, you will be able to take the exam in 15 minutes. Okay. And it will be timed, of course. It will be closed after 50 minutes. And so that's what we're going to do next class. Okay. Do you have any questions,
The exam is
guys?
still based on the PPTs, right?
Well, the PPTs and of course the book.
Okay, thank you, Miss.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Teacher, what until
Yes,
what topic
Astrid.
are we gonna?
Astrid, go ahead. Remember to use the hand, you guys.
Yes, it would be through Microsoft Forms, right?
It will be through Microsoft Forms. Yes, like last semester.
And we would be on the call, right? With the cameras open or without the cameras? I just
That's a
want
good
to know.
question. That's a good question. Yes, please. You will be required to have the cameras on while you are taking the exam. Any other question? Are you sure? Yes, Mariana.
Uh, the topics are going to be until this one we saw.
I believe I said it was going to be until Miguel Alemán. This one, no. This one will be for next exam. Miguel
Okay, and
Alemán, we talked about him yesterday. Yes.
and from the book, I believe it's chapter 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. You're welcome. Any other question? No? Are you guys sure?
From which chapters is the exam based on?
Introduction, chapter 1 and 2.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you guys. If there are no other questions,
Sure,
this
I
is
have
it.
a question.
Yes, always remember to use the hand. But go ahead.
Sorry. So United States never intervened in our country because we were never a socialist country, or why?
No, that's not accurate. It didn't have a direct intervention such as the intervention that it had in other countries, in other Latin American countries. For example, Chile, that they did have a military involvement in the overthrowing of Salvador Allende as the president in Chile. It did, though, it did have interest in Mexico, and it did uh, maintain, constant negotiations with the Mexican governments. And it did try to push Mexico into aligning with some of its ideals. However, the economic interdependence between both countries, the U.S. and Mexico, was so high after the war, so high. Even when the war was over, during the war it was over 90% of the trade, right? But even when the war was over and this interdependence decreased, the trade, the interdependence between both countries was still very high, and is still very high to this day. By then, we were talking about 80% of Mexican exports going into the US. Okay. Today, we talk about a little bit over 70%. I mean, it hasn't changed that much. And so the interdependence was so high that the US was very careful with affecting those economic interests because American economic interests in Mexico were already really high, not just because of trade, but because of investment. And so, um, bothering Mexico or trying to invade Mexico or causing any conflict, armed conflict with Mexico, would affect those American interests, which are really high. And by the time we're already really high. And so the US has always been really, really careful with the amount of pressure that it puts in Mexico. If you have realized, it is very careful. It doesn't go directly into a confrontation with Mexico. Well, at least until before Trump. It doesn't go into a direct confrontation with Mexico ever, not in the way that it does with other countries around the world. And it has to do with American interest, economic American interest in our country. So that's what I would say.
Oh, thanks. That's a nice question. A nice answer.
Oh, thanks. So you guys, it's already 8:40. And if you have any question, please let me know through the chat. Remember, those who DM'd me last night are the only ones who can send me an email, okay? The rest, you are supposed to have already uploaded your homework. And if you didn't have trouble at the time, that's great, okay? Those who DM'd me last night, those are the ones allowed to send me an email. So if there are no further questions, I will see you next class with the exam, okay?
Yes,
Okay.
Yes,
thank you.
thank you.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Thank you.
You
Have a nice
too.
day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have
Have
a
a nice
You
nice day. Thank
too.
you.
Bye-bye.